Welcome, everybody. Thanks, Anne, for the opening. Indeed, I'm Thibaut. I'm part of the core team. Very happy to bring this project to fruition. And I'm also CEO and founder of the Transmutation Principle, which is an agency working on sustainability. And resilience and adaptation is an important topic we find extremely underrated in Singapore and beyond, as most of you may actually already realize since you came today to talk about that topic. Related to this topic today, in this opening, there will be a few different steps that I like to cover. First one is to remind everybody what we are really talking about when it comes to adaptation. Because sometimes, adaptation is a topic full of misunderstandings and full of myth that we need to debunk. Then we'll actually go for a bit of context in for Asia, and ultimately we'll talk about a few solutions. All of the topics I'll be covering during this opening will be actually things developed way more during the workshop, master classes, and also the sessions you'll be attending here on the main stage. And this is what we'll talk about. Related to COP, one last thing, we'll talk a lot. Most of the content, most of the data we'll be using in this opening are actually coming from directly the IPCC Working Group 2, AR6, which is, as you know, I guess, a strong pillar of the COP movement. But before we actually start talking about the topic per se, a quick icebreaker, I would just like to ask you one thing. If your bathroom is flooded, what is the first thing you are going to do? Don't be shy.
Call your agent.
Okay. Okay. Exactly. Yeah. Okay. Now it's interesting because you started to answer the next question, but the first thing we may all do is something about the tap, like stop the tap, like turn it off. Thing is, what happens if it gets worse? You call your neighbors, call the management. What else can you do? Yeah, you can be very creative. Huh? You can call a repairman. You can also take the water out from the window. Sorry for the neighbors. Okay? Exactly. Do you see the metaphor with mitigation and adaptation through this example? Mitigation is the tap. It's actually what is filling the reservoir of the bathtub. Problem, as you know, it's partly rigged. This tap is not working perfectly. That's exactly the problem we are talking about when it's about mitigation. And what can you do? But you can adapt. So you call your neighbors. You can rechannel the water. You can do a lot of things, actually. Adaptation brings a lot of creativity in the process. Can you now also identify the differences, through this example, the differences between mitigation and adaptation? What do they address? Do they address the same thing? Okay, yeah. What else? Anybody else? Exactly. It's here, you have a lot of data, a lot of information here. You have three major differences between mitigation and adaptation. First one, obviously, you address something different. One addresses the causes, one addresses the consequences. Okay. Another thing also quite important, the timeline, extremely important. Adaptation is for now. When you are hit by a flood, you do things right now. You can't wait for 20 years and say, oh, let's see how it's going to go. Okay. The example of Spain is actually exactly like this. Mitigation, on the other hand, it's actually at best in the long term, medium term. We are not going to be able to see the consequences of our policies on mitigation right away. One more thing, the scale. Mitigation is global, adaptation is local. It's extremely important and empowering to know that adaptation strategies are mostly for the people, by the people locally. We can't hide behind somebody saying, oh, US, China, they're not doing their part of the job. Why should I? Well, if you're hit by a flood, when you're hit by a hurricane, you have to do it. You have to adapt. So it's quite powerful to see that, yes, we can bear the consequences, but we are also the ones to act. This one, a kind of complex slide, a slide that some of you may actually talk about in depth if you join the workshop, the adaptation workshop later. It's from the IPCC AR6, and it says one capital critical message about adaptation if there's one thing you may have to remember today, that's going to be this one, I would say. It's adaptation is not giving up on mitigation. That's not the spirit of adaptation. We need to adapt no matter what. And this is a graph explaining you why. No matter how much we mitigate, we will still have differences and consequences to bear with at the end of the century. We already disrupted climate. We know that. We'll have to pay this for some time. And no matter how much we mitigate, we will need to adapt. It's in a way to say it, you can kiss goodbye to the weather of yesterday, because none of us here will live it again until we die, even though we mitigate. So we need to adapt, because we will have to brace for impact no matter what. And mitigation makes sure we will adapt, we will actually decrease our emissions enough so we can adapt. That's actually the drill. If we don't mitigate enough, we will live in a world that cannot be adaptable anymore. And one important thing also, the differences between global warming and climate change. I guess most of you see it, but I will still put this here. When we talk about adaptation, we need to enlarge, to widen the scope a lot. Global warming is higher temperatures. Adaptation and climate change issues are actually covering a lot of other things, sea level rise, ocean acidification, etc. The so-called planetary boundaries, in a way. A few more things related to adaptation. We need to also think about the terms. What are we talking about? You have two kinds of risks, mostly. Physical risks, example, a hurricane in the middle of an ocean hitting a coastline, and you have transition risks. Transition risks, what are they? They are a change in regulation or a change in economies, in societies that will bring impact to organizations. Example, you have a new price on carbon tax. Obviously, you will have to adapt, and you will have to find a way as an organization to cope with the new normal. They are very important. Most of the time when we think of risks, especially in Singapore, we think of transition risks. But we are also exposed to physical risks, sea level rise, and so on. A risk, what is it made of? A hazard, a vulnerability, and an exposure. Hazard is defined by a few things: certainty, intensity, and frequency. A hurricane has a probability to happen with a certain level of intensity and with a specific duration. On top of that, you have vulnerability. What is a vulnerability? Is actually your inner characteristic that makes you weak to the risk. Very important as well. Vulnerabilities are mostly covered by access to resources, whether financially, whether knowledge-based. But it's also depending a lot on policies. And you'll talk about that, you'll hear about that today. Vulnerabilities are correlated a lot to climate policies. And finally, you have exposure, that I like to say it's actually a space and time problem. It's being at the wrong place at the wrong time. You are not exposed to the same things, whether you are in Singapore, in Kenya, or in North America. And these three things combined lead to impacts, consequences if you prefer. And if you want to decrease your risk, if you want to be more, to work on adaptation, you can either decrease your vulnerabilities, decrease your exposure, or reduce the hazard. And reducing the hazard is called mitigation. And there you are. These two things are finally connected. And one last thing that the IPCC AR6 mentioned a few years ago that is really important is that in a climate adaptation strategy, you cannot exclude from your audit, from your assessment of the situation, the solution itself. Because depending on the solution you may leverage to answer to adaptation, to a climate risk, you may create a maladaptation and you may create co-benefits. Maladaptation, what does it mean? It means through the solutions you are creating, you actually make the situation worse for climate. Example, very provocative, but I guess you are expecting this one, AC. Aircon is actually a maladaptation. Why? Because you increase your energy consumption to cope with a higher temperature, and this higher consumption leads to more greenhouse gases and so on, and you create a feedback loop. That's a maladaptation. But on the other hand, you also have the good way, virtuous cycle, where you can create co-benefits leading to some mitigation solutions, reducing the hazard itself. Example, you have everything related to nature-based solutions. Nature-based solutions are a good example of solutions that can increase your adaptation capacities, but also increase the mitigation effort. So yes, the solution itself is part of the problem when it comes to adaptation. Now, related to Southeast Asia and Singapore, a few things to add. Why adaptation is extremely important here is because among the 20 countries with the greatest exposure to sea level rise, 12 are located in Asia. That's the main risk that we have in Asia. That's one amongst a lot of others. You'll see on Singapore, we don't have only this problem, even though we are on a small island, but specifically sea level rise will bear a lot of impact. And 8 of these 12 countries represent 70% of the zones at risk. When it comes to global warming more specifically, because we talk a lot about sea level rise, but that's not the only thing, Asia is warming faster than the average, which means that we'll need to adapt faster. Why? Well, I'm not gonna talk too much about the climate system today, but it's mostly related to the humidity in the atmosphere. I mean, we all know how humid it can be in Singapore. This is also the reason why temperature can increase faster. And on average, we reached, maybe you've seen yesterday, but we reached 1.5 plus 1.5 degrees increase since pre-industrial era. This was in 2022. In Asia, we were roughly at plus 2.4. And at that time, we were at 1.3 globally. So we are on a trajectory to go at least at plus 4 in 2050. If you want an easy way to remember, you take the average, you multiply it by 2. This is pretty much what's going to happen for sea level, for Southeast Asia and Singapore. Averages can be extremely misleading. And one thing that we forget a lot in Singapore, it's never about climate so much. It's actually always about things behind it, economies, social benefits, health. You can see a few examples just of this year, actually, except the Asia Development Bank, a lot of examples saying that if we don't adapt, adaptation and the climate disasters we are facing are already causing a lot of problems on the economies. It's never only about dealing with a hurricane, it's always about reconstructing and making sure the societies and communities are adapted. And for Singapore, you have here a little map explaining pretty much what kind of impacts, what kind of risks we are facing here. We are on a small island, and you can see that even on a small island, you have a lot of differences depending on the district in terms of climate disasters. So I guess you will recognize the legend, the caption, not so complex, the icons are easy to understand. North of Singapore will be facing a lot of problems related to flood. Then you will have sea level rise in the east and in the west, south. Problem on greenery and biodiversity for the places where you have the secondary forest, Pulau Ubin, and also heat waves due to urban heat, which Singapore is actually leading in terms of science. That's the reason why Singapore is good at urban heat management, because that's one of the big risks we have to face, specifically in Queenstown and in the southwest. So what are the solutions? The solutions recommended by the IPCC have roughly 3 important areas, 3 important pillars: level planning and policies that you will deep dive a lot in during the session, community-based adaptation solutions through building resilient communities, and finally, investments. And all it's the innovative ways to finance this. Roughly, we estimate that in 2020, adaptation cost 70 billion per year, 17 billion USD per year in the developing countries. We expect this to rise around 150 to $200 billion a year by 2035. So we need a lot of money to adapt, and we are definitely not up to the challenge with the money that we are putting right now on the line. In Singapore, you also have a solution called the Long Island Project that we won't have the time to mention this opening, but I will really encourage you to stay in this evening, because that's going to be a topic that we'll cover. But that's a possible solution also, like big infrastructure evolutions. And I wanted just to focus on one more thing in terms of solutions. It's everything related to India, which we'll have a panel on, and we'll focus a lot today. The solutions in India are focused a lot in community-based solutions to build local and resilient ecosystems. What is resilience? Is the capacity to recover from an issue, a challenge that you are facing. It's about building something that can absorb more the shock and can recover faster. So you have a few examples here. You have some in Uttar Pradesh, you have some in Odisha. That's the kind of things you'll be hearing about the panel in India. But you can see that solutions do not have to be only tech-oriented. They can also be about social innovation, And that's actually important also to remember. And the thing that you can also remember is that adaptation, putting things in silos is the opposite and the enemy of adaptation. Adaptation is about cascading effects a lot and about interconnectivities. IPCC AR6 is also mentioning this a lot. When you have one climate disaster, you will have a lot of consequences afterwards in your ecosystems. And for successful adaptation strategies, the recommendation of the IPCC, you can kind of have 4 that are really emphasized a lot in the reports. Engage all stakeholders in the design of solutions. It's important. I've worked in a few years ago now on a project with an organization, a building company building a 5-star resort in Bali. And they were talking about their strategy on adaptation. And the thing they were mentioning is that the stake they had, the thing they wanted to make sure it would survive was the building after 5 years, after it was only about the operator's problem. So when you don't have the operator, like, I don't know, like Accor, and the construction company working together on an adaptation strategy in the long term, you cannot have something consistent because they have different stakes. Some is going to be for 5 years, for some other people it may be for 10. So stakeholders need to agree on the stake. What do they want to serve, to protect, and how long, what is their timeline, and what's the commitment for them. Another thing, it's also to decide the long-term goal, to design the roadmap. For adaptation strategies are complex, so for a good adaptation strategy, we need a plan. And to come with a plan, we need an objective. We need the thing at sight. We need the end game. Without the end game, you cannot design a solution, a roadmap for your adaptation strategy. Two other things, the capacity to orchestrate concrete narratives, engaging narratives. Without narratives, you don't have adaptation. You need a story for adaptation. You need to give to people the perspectives of what is the future status you want to target. And ultimately, identify co-benefits to synergize mitigation alongside adaptation efforts, as discussed earlier with the graph. So with this slide, I would like to I hope that I managed to give you some elements that will be important for you to cover, some elements of languages. See you later. Wish you the best. I'm sure you're going to have an amazing time today.